But I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend by every means at our command.
Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where we discuss leaders, their decisions, and how they shape the world we live in today.
In this episode of the History in Motion podcast, we dive into the life of Charlemagne, warrior, reformer, and the first emperor crowned in the West since ancient Rome. His rule reshaped the political, religious, and cultural fabric of medieval Europe. From brutal campaigns to the revival of learning, and from his partnership with the Papacy to the legends that followed, we explore how Charlemagne became known as the father of Europe. This is the History in Motion podcast.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the History in Motion podcast, where today we are going to the Middle Ages and talking about Charlemagne. And Charlemagne's definitely a name that pretty much I think most people know if they're casual fans of history. But you know, Richie, we were chatting a little bit before this and we were saying like, yeah, we knew kind of who Charlemagne was. But if you asked me to explain from the year 500 to the year 900, I'd give you a lot of blank stares about, well, it's after the Romans and before proper Europe of like the late Middle Ages, early Renaissance. There's a lot that needs to happen. And I think it's a time period that kind of gets brushed over a lot. But when we really look at what Europe becomes, this is the time period where we really start to see that transition from, you know, that Western Roman Empire into, I guess, what Europe will end up becoming in, you know, the Middle Ages and then into the Renaissance.
Yeah, it's such a good point. And I think when we look at like how history is taught or how it's often represented, and I think we're kind of like unintentionally guilty of this as well, which is you kind of go from the fall of Rome and you kind of skip ahead to the Crusades or the Norman conquest. And you kind of leave like this period, even though it's kind of a bridge between the two, right? And I think we'll see, you know, Charlemagne's empire is a bit more complicated because it ends up splintering pretty quickly after his death. And then how do you even categorize this period, right? We call it the Middle Ages, but was it Rome reborn? Was it like this kind of medieval experiment? Was it a papal power play? So in some ways, I think the ambiguity makes it less dramatic than like the fall of Rome or the, you know, the Crusades. But then I find the ambiguity actually more interesting because there's so much unknown around it when it comes to these like broader historical discussions.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like you were just telling me before, how you got deep into all the little tribes that are popping up around this time, and who are they? What did they look like? What were they on about? And I think that's makes it so interesting because, like we said before, you know, we could breeze through 100 years of the Roman Empire and be like, things are peaceful. There was some border fighting, but you're not really seeing anything. You know, there's no new entities really coming around until the Huns show up and some of these Germanic tribes show up. There's some really big stable time that's like, yeah, the Romans fought the Parthians again, and then they made a peace agreement, and then this changed hands. Where here it's like not total chaos, but all right, Rome has fallen. We've got all these tribes. Someone's going to have to figure out who wants to run these certain areas because, you know, there's so many fractured little tribes that are trying to come together. And that's where we're going to see Charlemagne and especially the Franks really start to change that landscape a little bit. And for those listeners who are saying Franks, that sounds very close to French. You'd be absolutely correct. We are going to be talking today about the precursor kingdom of the nation of France. And we'll see how Charlemagne and his rise really set the seeds for what the country of France and Germany and a lot of Italy are actually going to look like, you know, in the next 400 or 500 years.
And I think that's one of the hardest aspects of doing an episode like this, because it's just so close to well, not so close. We're talking several hundred years, but and then the breadth of timelines, it's on the cusp of starting to see the Europe form that we, you know, understand it today. That kind of goes into the early modern period and what we talk about. So that foundation's kind of getting laid. But I think with all of the different tribal people that are out there and understanding what their roles are and how this period is very formative is actually, you know, quite interesting in terms of what's going to come shortly after Charlemagne's reign.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, to start this all off, you know, you can't have an episode with me around this time without me talking about Rome. It's just, You're on the History in Motion podcast, and I'm talking. You're going to get some Roman history, just the way we roll around here. So this really starts in 481. So this is like right after the Roman Empire falls, or he's kind of in the transition of following. And there's this guy named Clovis I, and he becomes king of basically a Frankish tribe. And so over the next 30 years, so he's working in modern day France, which is considered Gaul at this time. He unites the Franks and then just essentially conquers most of Gaul. So, it's 30 years, breeze over it, but he basically brings everything together. But the really key thing here, and we'll start to see this theme as we go along, he converts to Christianity. And that's big because the Franks are pagan and a lot of these Germanic tribes are pagan. And remember, the Roman Empire at this point is very Christian and is really pushing that narrative, or that religious narrative, onto a lot of these tribes that they encounter. But now that he's become Christian, he now has a natural alliance with the Eastern Roman Empire and what's kind of left of that Western Roman Empire. So he's really kind of aligning the Franks with this Gallo-Roman church, if you will. And that's important because we're going to start to see how Europe is starting to mold itself around Christianity. And this is a really big one because now we have two major players that aren't one of them not being Roman, and that's a big deal. And so this dynasty is essentially created. And it's funny because they kind of go away from, the Romans seeing themselves, very clean shaven and just kind of very put together. And they would always look at the barbarians and say, they had long hair, big beards, those sort of things. Well, now we have a Christian king, but they keep the long hair. So they're known as the long-haired kings. And this happens for about 300 years where, they're very powerful and they kind of have this look about them of, we're still keeping like our barbarian roots, if you will, but we're starting to mold ourselves into a little bit more of a proper empire, kingdom, if you will. And this is really going to start to change a little bit as time goes on, but it's going to really set the seeds for a really strong militaristic kingdom that's going to be able to expand, by the time Charlemagne comes around.
And I think this is probably one of the aspects, as soon as I started doing even the biographical research, the importance and the interplay of Christianity and Charlemagne and the Franks in general, right? I think it's not necessarily like a subtle silver lining. I think it's very much kind of first and foremost in terms of any historical analysis that happens when we're talking about Charlemagne. But it's interesting, the decision that tied the Franks so closely to the papacy, it kind of will set them up as defenders of this kind of orthodox faith. And it's interesting to see, geopolitically how this actually strengthens the relationship between the two, because if you kind of look back a little bit, Christianity was kind of this persecuted sect. And then by the time Charlemagne gets on the scene, it's no longer this persecuted sect anymore. It is a very strong foundational faith that's kind of spreading like wildfire across all of Europe.
Absolutely. And we're starting to already see too, and it's happening very quickly, that Muslim expansion as well into Europe and that Christian expansion within Europe. And guess what? We've got kind of our first big monumental battle. There's definitely been battles before this, but this is the big one. So the Franks had something called a mayor of the palace, and they were essentially chief administrators for the kings, but they started to get these like weird power struggles where these chief administrators were kind of having more power than the kings in some sense. So it's a little bit of an odd setup, but one of the mayors was named Charles Martel. And this is, we're jumping ahead to around the year 714 to 741 is when he lived. And actually a Muslim army that has been expanding through Spain. So if we look at kind of the lay of the land, Spain has had a lot of conquests from Muslims coming out of North Africa. We still have Ostrogoth kingdoms and other Gothic kingdoms kind of floating around. You have the Lombards in northern Italy. You have a lot of different tribes kind of finding their footing, but the Muslims are starting to move into Spain, and now they're trying to get into France. And there's a big battle called the Battle of Tours. And this is where Charles Martel's Frankish army defeats this incoming Muslim army. Now, depending on how you look at history, if you are a very pro-Christian type person, this is, oh my God, Europe was saved from this invading Muslim army. And this is one of the most important battles in history. Really, this is just one of the many battles between Christians and Muslims. And really, this was just the Franks expanding, their territory. And I think if we look at this time period, the Franks were already pretty powerful. And I don't think there was really ever too much to worry about it, that Muslims were going to come in and just conquer all of Europe. They were they were doing well in Spain, but the Franks were doing well in France. And naturally, these battles come. But it's a big deal, though, because you can see this battle, this Christian army defeating this Muslim army. That's a great narrative right there. And the fact that the Christians win, well, God must be on their side, right? Because how else would they have won? And then that's going to really push that narrative more and more, because you have to remember, too, we're talking about this change in France and in Gaul at this time where we're moving into this more Christian world. But we talk a little bit more about it from like a king's perspective and the court. Your peasant farmer out in the fringes, he might be Christian, he might not, he may have no idea what's going on, and he might just be kind of doing the old thing. So to have these stories and more things like this, it's going to take time for Christianity to propagate amongst the peasant class as well. So these types of things are really important, despite the fact they might be more just great stories. And obviously it's a great battle and it shows that the Franks are very powerful, but it's the narrative that's going to come out of it that's going to be quite important too. And we'll see quite soon how Martel is going to be able to take this and use a lot of that win and that, hey, big battle, big win for Christianity, and use it to kind of strengthen the power of the church within his kingdom.
Special shout out to the Rest is History podcast on their 3-parter about this this point in history, because I think what the Charles Martel piece is very interesting to me because, well, one, he has a great nickname, the Hammer. I think that is such a great symbol for what he represented, which is, his military strength and bravado. But contextually speaking, what is this actually doing and what foundation is it laying? And I think my takeaway, Paul, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this, was that, he wasn't a king, he's kind of this kind of prime ministerial role. That's kind of how I see that position within this structure that he's operating in. But without him, the rise that we're going to see ultimately to Charlemagne's coronation 800 probably wouldn't have happened. And his life I think it demarcates this point where it's a shift from old tribal kingship to this Christian militarized dynasty building, Frankish state. And I think that's kind of the shift he represents, at least in my eyes.
Absolutely. And I think Martel, there's a little tension with him in the church. So I think maybe not quite yet with him, just because we see him seize some land and from the church and give it to his soldiers, and maybe a little bit more traditional Roman style, land grabs for his soldiers. But it's really his son, Pepin, or Pepin the Short. And he's the one I think that fits in that mold exactly what you were saying, Richie, because with him, he basically, they call it the Carolingian coup, and he takes power of the Franks in a more formal sense. But now he's legitimized by spiritual approval. So Pope Stephen II anoints him and his sons with holy oil in 754, a ceremony making him King God's chosen ruler. So it's like King, God, kind of all coming together. And now you have this relationship with the Pope. So the legitimacy of the Franks now is backed by the Pope, is backed by Christianity, and is backed by God ultimately. And now you've started to see, that relationship coming. And then, though, you might be saying, okay, well, where the heck did the Pope come through all of this? Now, the Pope has definitely had a relationship with the Franks, but there's a big reason for that. If we look at a map in your head, think of France, think of it, okay, that's where the Franks are. Think of Rome, that's where the Pope is. And then up in northwest Italy, where Milan is today, you have the Lombards. And these are a Germanic group. They're not Christian, and they're consistently harassing the Pope. There's a big fear that the Lombards are going to come and sack Rome. And so this is where the Pope goes to the Franks and says, can you guys help me out? And in 756, Pepin actually defeats the Lombards. And then the Pope grants him lands in central Italy around Ravenna, which again is another kind of Roman connection because the Romans actually moved their capital to Ravenna. So there's always this relationship a little bit here. And so in return, Pepin was titled Patrician of the Romans. And so essentially cementing that the Franks are the protectors of the papacy. We've given them lands in Italy around old Roman capital cities to really cement that. So there's a lot of symbolism going on here, but it's so big because now you have the Franks and the church really interconnected. And then essentially this lays the land for Pepin's sons to come around and take that to the next level. So the two sons, one is named Carloman. He dies quite young. The other is the man of the hour, and that's Charlemagne. So you can see the world that he's going to be coming into here. The Franks and the church, they're very much interconnected. The Franks are the protectors of the church, and, papal legitimacy has been given to the Franks at this point. And that's something that Charlemagne's going to be able to take and, take to the next level.
The interconnectedness at this point, I think, is so interesting as well, because it seems like the church, after the fall of Rome, we have the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople. The church still obviously wields some power. They're kind of this like moral authority in some way. I don't think that ever leaves, but it seems like they're politically vulnerable up until this point. And then this is the opportunity to kind of get back into that political arena with this alliance that starts forming with the Franks.
Absolutely. And if you think too, we've already started to see the Pope and the Eastern Roman Empire, now I guess we can call them the Byzantines, there's starting to be some little bits of arguments, and you can start to see the seeds of orthodoxy starting to come into the East. But from the Byzantines' standpoint, they call themselves the Roman Empire. And as far as they're concerned, modern day Spain, France, Italy, North Africa is still technically their land. It's just disputed at this point. And so we'll start to see how there's a little bit of this power play and a little bit of this, we got to make everybody happy here if you're going to make this work, because, the Byzantines are still very powerful, and you can't discount that. But to be able to say, hey, the Pope is anointed this Frankish king, the Byzantines are kind of looking at this going, okay, maybe not exactly what we had in mind, but the Pope is kind of like, well, we're having some disagreements too. So you're starting to see like the fracturing. That's why we really kind of doubled down on this transition period, because at some point we're going to be like, yeah, you have Roman Catholicism, you have Eastern Orthodoxy for Christianity that gets split. You can start to see a little bit of that coming, but at this point, they're all still trying to tip their hats to each other and make sure that everything is normal, especially if you're the Franks towards the Byzantines. But, definitely that's where we're going to see at least Charlemagne have to play both sides a little bit to make sure that, he's not overstepping in any of those areas.
Exactly. So if we get into Charlemagne's kind of early life and rise to power, he's definitely defined by kind of his, military expansion. But so when Pepin dies in 768, the realm is divided between Charlemagne and his younger brother. But, tensions quickly arose between them, threatening the unity of the kingdom. Charlemagne even went as far as forging an alliance with the Lombard king by marrying his daughter. This act obviously worried the papacy and kind of exacerbated the rivalry between the two. But that crisis was averted, Paul, to your point, when Carloman died in 771. And this is where Charlemagne kind of swiftly asserts control over his territories as well. And he pretty much just ignores the claims of any of the nephews or other males in the family and says, I am the sole ruler of the Franks. And now he is undisputed king, and he begins expanding and consolidating his power across Europe. And this is where I think his reign is kind of defined by his continuous military campaigns that, greatly expand his empire's frontier. He's this kind of skilled warrior king, and he had spent, 30 years in total leading Frankish armies across Europe. And this is just some of the campaigns. There's probably many minor ones, but the big ones would be the Saxon Wars from 772 to 804. This was his longest and most relentless war against the pagan Saxons in Germania. He gradually actually subdued the Saxon tribes and forcibly converted them to Christianity. This conflict was probably one of the more notable just because of its brutality. At one point, after a Saxon rebellion in 782, Charlemagne allegedly ordered the mass execution of 4,500 Saxon prisoners at Verdun as a punishment. Resistance kind of flared under the leaders under the Saxon rule, but by 804, the Saxons were pretty much finally conquered and integrated into Charlemagne's realm. Then you have the conquest of the Lombards from 773 to 774. So this was a direct response to Pope Adrian's plea for protection. Charlemagne marched into Italy to confront the king of the Lombards, who was threatening Rome. He besieged the Lombard capital of Pavia, and by 774, the Lombard kingdom falls, so within a year. And Charlemagne assumed the Iron Crown of Lombardy. So he became king of the Lombards in addition to king of the Franks. So this victory not only added northern Italy to his domain, but also reinforced his role as protector of the papacy.
And I think it's a big deal too when we talk about the Saxons, not to be confused with the Anglo-Saxons. They'll come later, but this is essentially Germany, right? These are the tribes that, if we think of the Romans, they could never conquer this land and eventually just stopped trying altogether. But these are essentially pagans, non-Christians in Germany who, are coming to clash with Charlemagne. And like you said, Richie, like those executions and deporting of 10,000 Saxon families and then making them kind of settle in other parts of his empire so they can start integrating and kind of their traditional Saxon beliefs are going to kind of fade away. And you even see him do things. This is Charlemagne when he comes into a lot of Saxon lands. He actually removes this sacred tree pillar, if you will, that was like a cornerstone of pagan worship. And that was kind of his big thing, is I'm going to knock down and destroy a lot of these religious symbols and start converting to Christianity. Whether it's voluntary, whether it's by the sword, he's going to turn a lot of these Saxons to become Christian. And so, again, it's definitely on brand for this time period and kind of what he's wanting to do, but he's very, very powerful. And like you said, just those are two big kingdoms. You know, this Pope is terrified of the Lombards. His father defeats them. Charlemagne kind of puts the final nail in the coffin, and the Saxons have been there for a long time, and they've got a lot of power too. And he's able to come in and, you know, over the course of 25, 30 years, really put them down a notch and eventually defeat them, which again is no small matter, especially if you look at a map now of the kingdom of the Franks. It's France, most of Germany, and northern Italy. And, you know, those are lands that have been ruled by a variety of tribes for a long, long time. And now we've kind of got some unification, and it's a Christian unification. You know, that's a big deal and is going to explain probably the next many, many years of history on, you know, why Christianity is going to be such a key point, you know, in that area. Yeah.
And I think that's such a great kind of segue to his next campaign. So, you know, we're looking at it from kind of that kind of European, you know, Western European perspective. I know it doesn't exist fully yet, but in the sense that, you know, Christianity is kind of like the marching order that's kind of manifesting with a lot of these campaigns. But then, Paul, like to your point from earlier in this episode, which is, you know, the Muslim threat from the East. And this is where his campaign in Spain and the Spanish March is actually quite interesting in the year 778. So Charlemagne ventures across the Pyrenees to check Muslim power and expansion. So he leads this expedition into northern Spain, but it actually ends up in a very difficult retreat. Basque forces actually ambush Charlemagne's rear guard, and it actually results in the death of one of his most famous commanders, Roland. This is a huge military setback. This event later is kind of romanticized in this epic song called The Song of Roland, which kind of mythologizes Charlemagne's struggle against this kind of power group. And in the 790, he actually establishes the Spanish March, which is a borderland county in Catalonia, kind of the buffer zone between the Frankish realm and the Islamic Caliphate. So kind of starting to establish some of the boundaries that we're going to start seeing, you know, for the next, you know, few centuries. And then lastly, probably one of the last notable campaigns is from 788 to 796. Charlemagne also moved to incorporate neighboring Christian and pagan territories into Central Europe. So in 788, he disposes the Duke of Bavaria and absorbs Bavaria. So this opens the way to attack the Avars, which is a steppe people in the Danube region. Frankish forces, with the help of their subject Slavs, crush the Avar cognate by 796, and then they kind of seize a massive hoard of treasure. And this kind of stronghold that the Avars had is now destroyed. Their power is broken, and this again extends the empire into modern parts of Austria and Hungary. So again, I think one of the defining features of Charlemagne is definitely his military expansion, because it does lay the foundation for what we're going to see next. And I think it just emboldens and strengthens his interconnectedness and relationship with the papacy.
Absolutely. And I think too that all that money they're bringing back now too, right? You're not just a great military conqueror, but you're about to become filthy rich. And I think there's even a story about all the gold that they steal in that battle you just mentioned about. I think somebody was back in the capital city, and he was just basically making notes of these carts. They just kept coming every day, more and more carts just filled with gold and treasure. And he's like, you know, hey, this is awesome because, you know, we've just become very, very rich. But it's something that he'd never seen before. And I think we're pushing them past a little bit of just, you know, in my head of just, hey, really great warlords. But now you've got this economic base. You've got support of the Pope. And it's all just starting to come together into building this really powerful kingdom. And, you know, now we're even starting to touch parts of Central Europe. You mentioned going into Austria-Hungary, which, well, you know, foreshadows kind of some successor kingdom sort of setups here. But yeah, it's very quick how this all kind of comes together, despite, you know, some of these setbacks that, you know, it's great to look at maps of this and say, oh, here's a bunch of tribes. And then 100 years later, bang, there's the Frankish kingdom, and it's quite large and quite powerful.
Yeah, in terms of like the breadth, so this is by the year 800. So through these campaigns, you have Charlemagne's empire, which is kind of referred to as the Carolingian Empire. So this covers most of Western and Central Europe, and it encompasses present-day France, Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and, you know, just a bit of the area beyond northern Italy. So in a very real way, his conquest not only enlarged his realm, but again, this papal connection, spreads Christianity, often by force, into these frontier regions that were kind of untouched or were run by these pagan tribes, or, tribes that weren't falling, in line with this kind of Christian spread. And he kind of cements his reputation as this formidable warrior king, which was, pretty well earned from the successive military campaigns that he had. And, in doing so, he unites, more of Europe than anyone had since the days of the Western Roman Empire, which I think is, quite the accomplishment.
Yeah. And one thing I was thinking about too about all of this is this huge accomplishment. All these people are coming in. But one thing that I found interesting that I was just reading about on like the relationships with these other tribes, and it was really around communication. So, the Romans had been there for a while. Latin is really this written language. They've got these different languages that everybody is speaking. But what I found interesting was there's a story of these Saxon, I guess monks, wouldn't be monks, but some sort of people who've been learning how to read and write in their world. And they can speak and understand Latin in the more traditional sense based on what they've been reading. And so they come to the Franks and they assume the Franks are supposed to be speaking Latin, but, they start to speak Latin to them or try to listen. And they're like, this doesn't make any sense. This is Latin, but it's weird. It's so different. And I don't really understand what it is. Well, really what it is maybe not quite French, but it's starting to morph into French. And I think what's really interesting about this is after this fragmenting of the empire of Rome and all these tribes sort of finding their place, they've got a Latin base, but there's no real structure or central government, if you will, that's, putting out decrees and all these things in a standard form of Latin. And things just start to shift and start to change a little bit. And I think that's what's so interesting about the Franks is they were isolated, I guess, for a long enough time that their language could start to change. And then we really only see how different it actually is until people who come into their territory go, oh, that's not Latin, that's something else. And obviously it's not French yet, but it's going to slowly become it. And we start to see that, all around Europe. And, the more German language is going to come out. Italian is starting to be formed from, this older school kind of Latin speak. So it's a very interesting time. And I think, as we said, this is a time of transition, not just for territory, but also for languages and then, specific cultures as well.
Yeah, it's actually quite interesting. And it's probably just a interesting footnote for our listeners when, because I wasn't aware of this, but when historians kind of refer to, Germanic tribes, what they're actually talking about is different language groups, and how those language groups would transform into the languages, Paul, that you just mentioned. So, the Germanic tribes use these Germanic languages that would evolve into, what we consider French today, German, and, these other European languages that start to flourish, but they all kind of start centrally and organically with, what we call this kind of Proto-Germanic language, and then evolve through, this sociocultural process where different groups kind of take these languages and they evolve as per, their growth or their their structure as their own societies kind of evolve and grow.
Definitely. And I like it's just, again, it's so weird. It's like where the Romans didn't have any conquest, into Germany, you have those Germanic language groups really stick and hold on. Where in the areas controlled by Rome, you've got that Latin base, but then you've got the Germanic coming in and they kind of just all smash together, and next thing you know, people are speaking French or they're speaking Spanish or speaking Italian. I think it's super interesting. But yeah, I think this is just what makes this time period so cool is kind of the floodgates are open. Everybody's kind of crossing over these old borders and creating something new. And like we said, we'll see very soon, what those new things are going to be. But, I think I don't want to take away from just calling this a transition times. The Franks are a very distinct people with their distinct culture, distinct language, and some very cool stuff that they do. But I think just kind of to help frame it, it does help us to say, Rome, Franks, Holy Roman Empire, France, Germany, blah, blah, blah after that.
Yeah, 100%. And maybe just to make it a little bit more real. So there's kind of three main branches. I had taken this note earlier for their Germanic languages. So you have West Germanic, which kind of leads to German, Swiss German, Yiddish, English, Dutch, Flemish, Afrikaans. You have Northern Germanic, which is kind of Scandinavian. So the languages that take root in Sweden, Norway, and Iceland. And you have East Germanic, which is actually now extinct, which was once spoken by tribes from Scandinavia to Eastern Europe. And I think for me, this is where the history nerd really comes out strong, because you get to see and start to understand a part of history that is so kind of in the weeds. You're probably not going to cover it in any modern textbook or course just because it is quite complicated, but it just goes to show you this kind of evolution and change that's kind of always happening in the background, but it gets lost because it can seem kind of trivial. But when you really kind of, dig a little bit deeper, it does tell a very interesting story about how Europe is going to be reshaped and formed over the next, millennia.
Absolutely. And like you said, it is so easy to just brush over it. We see maps moving around and people moving back and forth, but this is the stuff that we can put a stamp on, today, which I think is super interesting. So getting back to Charlemagne, right? He's got this huge empire. Seems like he's got it under pretty big control. Is what's coming next for him here. He's not just sitting around. I think there's some stuff that needs to happen in Italy and a few other things, I think, to really even cement his power, even more than just military conquest.
Yeah. So his greatest title, and this is probably one of the most interesting points about his story, happens on Christmas Day in the year 800, when he is crowned Emperor of the Romans. So you might be asking yourself, what does that even mean at this point in time? Is that even a thing? But he is crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III in Rome. And this coronation is super interesting because it results from this convergence of Frankish power with papal need, which we've been talking about this entire time. But in 799, Pope Leo III had been attacked by a faction of Romans who had accused him of corruption. So he flees across the Alps, and he actually seeks refuge at Charlemagne's court, and he places himself under the Frankish king's protection. Charlemagne, who kind of sees himself as the guardian protector of Christendom, intervened, and he does it decisively. He escorts Leo back to Rome. He restores order, and he presides over a synod that reasserted Leo's innocence and position. So essentially this kind of like call to action on restoring power. So during the Christmas Mass at St. Peter's Basilica, the Pope unexpectedly, according to some accounts, placed a crown on Charlemagne's head, proclaiming him Imperator Romanor, which is Emperor of the Romans. So this is a very interesting act. And, symbolically, it does a couple of things. It kind of revives this imperial dignity in Western Europe, which had been kind of lost over the last 3 centuries after the fall of Rome, at least the Western Roman Empire. I'm going to be very specific here, in 476. And I think I was curious about how other historians have kind of looked at it. So it seems to be pretty long debated whether he was actually surprised by this coronation or had kind of planned it in advance. Einhard, who is his kind of like most famous biographer, claimed that Charlemagne was taken unaware and would not have attended the Mass had he known Leo's intentions, which is actually pretty interesting. However, some more modern scholars suggest that the king and Pope Leo had probably arranged the coronation to their mutual benefit. Kind of elevating Charlemagne to emperor gave the papacy a powerful ally and kind of added prestige to Leo's position, while it granted Charlemagne kind of this divine sanction for his rule over this new Western Empire. So again, you have this interconnectedness, which I now think is kind of solidified with this co-ruling kind of approach to the church's strength is now much more valid than it has been. And now Charlemagne, who is still, de facto ruler in terms of his military campaigns and empire that he's established, but there's much more authority for both of them now.
Definitely. Like now we have that both sides like kind of upping the ante a little bit. But I'm really interested in that whole piece on, was Charlemagne surprised? Did he actually want it? And I think you have to think about what this actually means. And you said it before. What does Emperor of the Romans even mean? Well, if you're sitting in Constantinople and you're the head of the Byzantine Empire and you still believe you are the true Romans, is this the Pope saying Charlemagne is now Emperor of all Romans, including the East? What does that even mean, right? And so I think Charlemagne, if he did have it manufactured, did very well controlling the narrative, saying like, look, I didn't know anything about this. I was just helping the Pope out because I'm a good Christian. And look what he did. And I like, what can I say no to the Pope? I have to do this. But because he's trying to play a little tongue in cheek, I think here with the Byzantines, because this essentially creates a rivalry. And he even starts talking about potentially marrying the Empress of Byzantium, or the Byzantine Empire at this time. And so, yeah, it's this like, you start to see, okay, well, who's actually the Emperor of the Romans? And the answer is they both are. And we really start to see, okay, well, there's another line right down the middle of that east-west split, especially in the church. And, now we're officially going to lay the groundwork for the Western Holy Roman Empire. But yeah, it's tricky because there's still this hold onto the Romans were so great. We're still the Romans. But everybody kind of wants to have their piece of that. They want the titles. They want to feel like the emperors of old. But it's a really powerful title that means a lot of things to a lot of people. And this is where I think Charlemagne does a decent job at trying to play off that diplomacy. But from the Pope's standpoint, he's pushing the East further and farther away with, making this decree.
I think this is actually, just to kind of double down on this for a minute. So obviously, like, the diplomatic relations between the two are going to be pretty fraught. But by 812, the Byzantines actually acknowledged Charlemagne as emperor, probably not emperor of the Romans, which is kind of interesting in deference to their own claims. But what I came across was that Charlemagne himself seemed to use the title very sparingly. He continued to kind of style himself as king of the Franks and Lombards, and in official documents maintained through like the Frankish courts, that's how he kind of signed documents, or he was often referred to. Nonetheless, though, to your point, Paul, like, this coronation of 800 was a milestone. It restores the idea of the Western Roman Empire with the Pope's blessing and kind of sets a new precedent for the medieval concept of the Holy Roman Empire that is going to continue to develop, for the next few centuries.
It's clever from Charlemagne, and we can definitely see for, some of these big warlords, he understands diplomacy very well. And I think, in our heads, thanks to the way the Romans would describe people like this, brutes, just there for war, long hair, big beards. Well, now we're really starting to see, like you said, that someone who's earned the title of being a successor emperor, really, and being able to understand the diplomatic elements of this and build a really great empire. And then we're going to see a lot of interesting reforms that he's going to do within the Frankish Empire itself. But yeah, he's got the title, he's got the empire. Now it's time to, I would say, probably put in some reforms and really stamp in, the Pope's giving you his blessing. Christianity is the basis of everything that you're doing. There's going to be a lot of interesting things that I think he's going to be able to do here to, really push forward and start to build what we talked about last time with Lafayette, is building that third estate. The clergy is going to start to become its own entity. And I think it really, I wouldn't say it starts with Charlemagne, but I think it gets a good kick, to really start growing into its own, independent thing.
The reforms are so interesting, right? And we'll get into a couple of them right now. And he introduces a number of them across education, which really stood out to me, religion, and kind of produces what, this theme of this, I guess you call it the Carolingian Renaissance in some ways. So one of his most enduring achievements was fostering an intellectual and cultural revival. And it was kind of initiated by his realization by the decline in learning and literacy. So he actually gathers some of the best scholars at his court, people from York, Italy, Ireland, and Spain. And under his patronage, this circle of intellectuals sets out to improve Latin literacy and education throughout his realm, which is seen as essential for effective governance and church administration, right? These things are now coupled, which I think is very interesting. So he issues orders, these kind of decrees to establish schools and monasteries and cathedrals to train not only clergy, but also lay officials. He even encouraged his own children and courtiers to pursue learning. And this is actually one of the things that really stood out to me, was the development of a clear, legible writing system known as Carolingian minuscule. This is a standardized script that made reading and copying texts easier. So scribes in this kind of like monastic tradition who were supported by Charlemagne would use this script to preserve many classic Latin and Christian works, some of which survive only in copies made in this era, but libraries were expanded and filled with books of scripture, liturgy, and classic literature. They would produce new textbooks, poetry, some annals of history. And as a result, through these kind of educational policies, Latin learning and literacy, markedly improved, and artistic expression in manuscripts and architecture, religious art begins to flourish. So this Renaissance, from like this educational perspective, in the modern sense, kind of provided basic tools. So schools, curricula, standardized texts, and Latin literacy that would kind of underpin that later medieval and intellectual growth. And, I think the influence of this Renaissance endured for centuries, and it kind of facilitated, future revivals by preserving knowledge that probably would have been lost otherwise if it wasn't for this particular reform in this domain.
Yeah, I think of all the things that Charlemagne does, this I think is probably the most important to what we see Europe becoming, because yes, literacy is very important, partially as a great way to solidify your empire. Well, if people can read, we'll give them a bunch of Bibles. They're going to be able to read about Christianity in the approved sense, if you will. And that's just going to be another unifying case. But I think one of the things that was interesting was you're talking about these monasteries and these essentially schools that were created to help with literacy and actually standardized script. And one of the things that I find interesting is when you look at the way the Romans would write, they would have like little dots between their words. And so we start to see a transition into more modern writing styles. So we start to see, instead of dots, they put spaces between words. They actually start capitalizing the first letters of sentences to understand where there's kind of breaks in thoughts. Then we even start to see some early punctuation. They use this odd little symbol to kind of represent a question, an exclamation, if you will. And then it starts to eventually turns into, exclamation point and question mark and those sort of things. So they're starting to even get past just write the words out, but how do we give expression? How do we understand tone? How do we understand that, this is a change from one thought to another? And those are big deals, right? Especially as people are learning to write and ideas are going to be transferred through writing. It's very important that these things come along. And they also do some things with the Bible. So the Bible itself has a bunch of different books in it. And traditionally, they were just kind of like their own thing. Okay, you'd read the book of Genesis, you'd read the Gospel of John. But now it's kind of all, they're like, what if we squish them all together and make this big book and we'll call it the Bible? Obviously, it wasn't that simple. But for them, you see some people writing at the time going, oh my goodness, I've got all this. I got all the religious texts in one book. This is incredible. And that kind of also starts to kickstart a little bit of a revolution in terms of how books and knowledge is being transferred. Is they're figuring out ways to, pack more words into more pages and be able to, get them out quicker. And people are doing, this is a full-time job of just writing books out because there's no printing press or anything at this time. We're very far from that. So seeing a lot of these sort of things outside of just, yes, religion, big deal, but also really fundamental changes in the way, we even look back at things we do today. There's a lot of groundwork that's being done here.
And in the theme of kind of like consolidation, structure, kind of reorganization of what's going on at the ground level, it's kind of a theme that cuts across another set of reforms, which is like religious reforms and church administration. So he actually addresses a range of concerns around the church at this point. And he actually enforces a very strict hierarchical structure in the church. He defines the roles and responsibilities of bishops and abbots. It kind of improves the education and moral character of the clergy by standardizing liturgy and church practices. So again, Paul, to your point, like consolidating all of these books into one book, which we'll now refer to as the Bible, but it also kind of supports him in rooting out pagan rituals among recently converted people, which is very interesting. So he kind of seeks out to ensure that this Christian doctrine is taught correctly, there's some structure to it, and that the parish priest could instruct their flocks in these basic tenets of faith, but do so in a way that's kind of standardized, which, I think it's interesting in terms of reforms for me because we think about the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, we kind of throw these words together. But what Charlemagne's doing here is the exact opposite of what I think most people would think is going on at this time after the fall of Rome. Yeah, I think it just goes to show that, as much as he was this kind of, military leader who expanded through these military conquests, he also was very strategic and progressive in some of his policies as far as it went to actually create this kind of better social realm for the people in his empire.
As you were just saying that, I was thinking a lot about Akbar the Great when we did his kind of story. Both guys, Charlemagne and Akbar, unbelievably brutal early on in their lives. We talked about essentially what could be considered a genocide of the Saxons and just incredible amounts of violence to get what he needs to bring his empire under his control and to start these forced conversions. And we saw that with Akbar on just, some of the violence against a lot of the Hindu populations in other parts of northern India. But it all kind of comes together, and then they're able to do a lot with that. And I think that's, again, just history 101, right? Is if you want power, you're going to have to be brutal and you're going to have to be violent, especially in this time. But they're able to kind of come together and start to do some things like maybe not be more progressive in the traditional sense, but definitely more progressive, I would say, for the time, all with the guise of how do we, keep this empire strong. But one thing with Charlemagne that I think is kind of the elephant in the room for him, and I think even people at the time, are starting to say this, is, you're supposed to be this Christian king, and you're doing a lot of very non-Christian things, the forced baptisms, conversion by sword, if you will. It probably very much a precursor for the Crusades and these holy wars, and we're going to see a lot more of them. But, it's tricky because, it's not very Christian of him. But if you're goal is to build an empire and bring more people into Christianity and, save them from their barbaric ways and their pagan ways. And maybe he's doing a really great thing in the eyes of Christianity. But, this is the juxtaposition we always run into with these religious kings is, there's, the religion teaches, it's not what Jesus was teaching. But then again, is he going to sit on his hands and wait for someone else to conquer him? Probably not. So it's always an interesting balance, but, it's one that I'm sure many people at the time are discussing around, at least in the theological standpoint.
Yeah. And that coupling is so important, right? And it kind of extends into some broader administrative and legal reforms. So just based on what a lot of historians see, I think the, takeaway is that he didn't radically innovate the actual government system itself, but he did make it more effective. So he often relied on just sworn oaths of allegiance and loyalty, like many rulers should at this point in time. But to improve oversight, he actually institutionalized missi dominici, it's the envoys of the Lord King. So this was actually a pair of royal agents. It would be typically one bishop or abbot and one lay noble, and they would be sent to travel through circuits of the empire to audit local authorities and ensure compliance with the king's commands. They would hear grievances, they checked out the administration of justice, and they would report back any abuses, and it kind of helped extend royal authority into these kind of farther off provinces. And Charlemagne himself would issue detailed instructions. For example, there's the Capitulary of 802, and this kind of outlines the duties of the envoy, underlining his intent to regularize administration throughout the realm. So he also kind of increases the use of these kind of written capitulary laws. So these are, official decrees on all aspects of governance. He tries to do this through communicating his policies uniformly across his empire, and he starts to standardize these laws and measurements for how to actually, execute against them. He reforms the currency. He actually introduced a more uniform silver coinage to protect merchants and the peasants via these royal decrees. And, he attempts to create a more governed and just society. So again, very interesting with these kind of modern aspects of governance and standardization. Something that I wouldn't have necessarily thought would be happening at this point in history, but it just goes to show you in terms of just, having an empire to rule over, these are the things that you ultimately have to start thinking about if you don't want, if you don't want chaos within your realm. And, he is intentionally doing all of the governance that, a ruler would need to.
Yeah. And I think you've mentioned it a couple of times, right? In my head, this is the dark ages in air quotes, but doesn't seem very dark to me, at least at this point, unless maybe you're a Saxon or one of these, tribes that he's conquering. But yeah, you're definitely starting to see those reforms start to come back, and you're starting to see a little bit of, progress, if you will. Things were crazy for a bit, and now we're starting to come into things, and eventually we'll get some nasty plagues and stuff come through that will slow things down for a little bit. But yeah, we're really starting to see Europe come out of that phase of just what the heck is happening? Who are all these people? What happened to the Romans? Are they even still around? To yeah, we've got this successor kingdom, we've got these reforms, and we've got a good base to kind of go on from. And we're seeing, some sort of progress, if you will, which is defining that as a whole nother thing. But I think, yeah, we're starting to see that now.
And he's still able to kind of balance all of this, right? I think to your point, and, I know it sounds funny, but he's doing things that are kind of unchristian to a certain degree. But, he had built this very close and lasting alliance with the papacy, the foundation that was laid by his father, his defeat of the Lombards, protecting Pope Adrian and Leo. He is tied to papal support, and he actually, as we've seen, reaffirms the church's rights over the papal states. And, the papacy continues to honor Charlemagne with these titles and his recognition, as far as the peak in, the year 800, where he's actually crowned as the emperor. And you're seeing this blend of, kingship and Roman Christian authority, which continues to elevate Charlemagne as this kind of, he holds such a unique position, because there's nothing that I've read at this point that would make me think, he's like this holy Roman warrior. The church is obviously just a huge part of society and the world at this point, but, the reforms aren't necessarily always backing what the church wants. And there is this kind of tension in some ways. But, at home, he's still able to manage that alliance in a very diplomatic way. But what's going on beyond? And he actually manages a pretty wide network of diplomatic and military relationships. So obviously his claim to the imperial title, as we had mentioned, creates tensions within the Byzantine Empire. And, there's some recognition that happens eventually. But he also fostered cordial exchanges with the caliphate. He's trading embassies and luxury gifts that kind of signaled a mutual prestige and, dare I say, respect and shared interest in countering rivals like the Umayyads of Spain. And he further strengthens his influence through contacts with the Anglo-Saxons, which we had touched on earlier in this episode, by making offerings and kind of cultivating this loyalty amongst Slavic and Baltic leaders on the frontiers. And this mix of alliances, negotiations, and continual conquests, he established himself as the dominant ruler of Europe. And he's even able to do so by, commanding respect from Constantinople all the way to Baghdad. So I think there's this kind of duality here, right? Like he's able to have papal authority. He's trying to strengthen his empire from within, but he's also cognizant enough to maintain like working relationships with people on the frontiers and, these other oppositional forces out there with this kind of like mutual diplomacy and, we'll call it respect, but, there is this element of having diplomatic relations outside of his own realm.
Yeah. And we even see that early on, right? He marries the Lombard king. He's even flirting with the short-lived kind of empress of the Byzantine Empire. And he gets it. He understands, maybe marriages are going to be great for diplomacy, but you can definitely see that diplomatic side to what he's doing. And, ultimately too, you mentioned, those elements of the church and kind of how he's doing things that may not be necessarily exactly what the church wants. But I think one could argue at this point, is he the church? Like he's obviously more powerful than the Pope. The Pope is saying, thank God for you're defending me. He may not have, you could have a Pope go rogue and kind of do what he wants and would create some challenges, but he's definitely putting his stamp on his version of Christianity. And I'm sure there's, like you said, there's a relationship with the Pope there, but when Charlemagne says it's going to happen, it's going to happen. And the Pope is going to have to probably play ball in most situations. But I think your point on the diplomacy side of things and kind of his way of seeing that Christian world is important, because now that he's got diplomatic relationships with all these other places and he's that kind of core anchor right now of what Christianity is going to become in the West, and having good relations, he's going to have that influence that's going to spread a little bit farther than, just within his kingdom or, even in parts of his kingdom, which still need to kind of be brought under his rule fully.
Yeah. And I think this is probably a good pivot point just to, I know we're coming close to the hour mark, but, his reign pretty much fundamentally reshapes medieval Europe in so many ways, right? It revives the idea of a unified Christian empire in the West. He's consolidating these vast territories under his rule, and he establishes, the Frankish Carolingian Empire, which, is short-lived after his death, but it kind of endures with this vision of Europe as this cultural and political entity as a whole that's somewhat consolidated, which is, pretty novel for this point in time. And his role as this kind of new Constantine kind of symbolizes the sacred authority of Christian rulership. And again, I think this is going to provide later emperors and even modern European leaders with a model of unity under shared values and shared institutions. So I think politically, he reinforces the structures that, would ultimately evolve into feudalism, binding nobles to him through these land grants and oaths of loyalty, while his system of delegated officials and written laws kind of demonstrates the need for a stronger central governance, which was, kind of difficult to accomplish in a fragmented post-Roman world. So he really does kind of set a new standard for what governance and, kingship kind of look like.
And that's so important to be able to get back to those larger empires and use the capacity and from a manpower and, whatever other level you want to go to from these large empires that, the Romans were able to do, and we'll see in the Ottoman Empire be able to do, and, all of these great empires that are going to kind of come around this region. And I think it's super interesting too, like you said, like once this breaks off into, and I think it's classic with a lot of emperor or a lot of people in history of, well, I've got 3 sons and they're great and they're going to be able to get along well and, hold the fort down. And obviously that doesn't happen. But really we get West Francia, which is the successor state to the Frankish kingdom, which becomes France. He has East Francia, which becomes Germany, essentially. Well, all the craziness that happens in Germany over the next 1,000+ years of all these little kingdoms kind of popping up, but eventually becomes the nation of Germany. And then you have elements of, Belgium, Netherlands, and even parts of Italy that kind of come out of this. And so, yes, it doesn't stay together, and they kind of start to become their own independent things. And then you see the Holy Roman Empire really spring out from a lot of what's been created. And so that all really comes back down to what Charlemagne's created, which I think is so cool, because when we look at that path of history, I almost like to look at Charlemagne as like this foundational kind of anchor point, because after Rome falls, nobody really knows what's going on. But now we can really start to transition and say, okay, well, Charlemagne built the Frankish Empire to the level that it was. It broke apart, but like you were mentioning, Richie, and I think it's important to double down on that, those foundational elements remained, and then new things were created, and they broke apart, and then new things were created. But it wasn't really this, Rome was Rome, and then it broke into all of these little empires run by Germanic tribes, which were very much not Roman and running things in the same way that we would consider Rome running things. And really, Europe declined at this point. But with Charlemagne, we really can start to see, okay, things are set again, and things are going to continue to move forward in a certain way. And those foundations, are really going to stay, whether that's Christianity, whether that's Christianity plus, is, always open for debate. But I think that's a really interesting point about Charlemagne, and I think why he's got, the reputation I think that he deserves.
Yeah, and I think that's like his legacy is so powerful that way, right? So he actually passes in 814 from I think the flu or some kind of cold that he does not recover from. But in terms of his legacy, the title Father of Europe kept coming up when I was doing my research, and I think it was a pretty bold claim. And it's funny, many of us has probably heard of Charlemagne, but I had never heard that title before. And I think in hindsight, after having, almost finished recording this episode with you and just like kind of reflecting back on the research, I think it's kind of an apt title in many ways. And our old friend Napoleon, I found a quote from him. He seems to come up everywhere. When he was kind of, in the throes of the Napoleonic Wars, famously declared, "I am Charlemagne," using his memory to kind of bolster his imperial ambition. So I think it really goes to show you the impact that Charlemagne had as kind of being seen as this father of Europe, and how someone could ultimately, unite diverse lands under a shared cultural and Christian framework, of course. And I think he kind of sets, a new mold, a new standard for what the world is going to look like, for the centuries that are to come, and what it's going to do for, the formation of modern Europe. And that is a very, very powerful legacy.
Yeah, I don't think I could have said it any better. That foundational part of, we know where Europe's going to become, and it's going to have its ups and downs, but it really does start with him. And yeah, for someone like Napoleon to be going back and saying, hey, I'm the new Charlemagne, which I think is interesting, coming out of a revolution that was very anti-church, but hey, we'll give him the warlord part, I guess. But yeah, I find it interesting. And I always wonder with people like this when we come in, because I'm like, I know Charlemagne was a big deal, but I know he had a big Christian element to it. And so when we look at historical figures that are so influential in the church, I always come in and assume, all right, there's some bias there, right? Because the church has been writing a lot of the history for a while. And we saw it with Constantine, did a lot of great things, but also did some kind of dumb things as well. But I think with Charlemagne, I think it's definitely warranted. And I don't think there obviously is some bias there of, if Christianity died off 200 years later, then we probably wouldn't be talking about him in the same vein, and Europe would look completely different. But the fact that it does stay and he does all of these things, I think Father of Europe makes a ton of sense, because it really needed somebody to bring it back together. Because we see in other parts of the world, in the Middle East, it's starting to expand in certain ways. The Chinese are doing some really amazing things, but Europe is trying to find its identity again. And I think the key here is Charlemagne gives them a little bit of an identity again, and then it's going to grow into a million different things. But, that Father of Europe title as that foundation that's brought back to Europe, I think the perfect way to put it. And I think well deserved.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think I enjoy these episodes so much because I go in with like barely a crumb of an idea of what I'm about to get into. And then I walk away with a vastly expanded understanding of how things are today, based on what happened 1,000 years ago. And I think Charlemagne definitely deserves the credit and the fanfare around what he was able to accomplish. He definitely, in my mind, in terms of kind of having that title of Father of Europe, definitely holds. I think he's probably one of the most influential people when it comes to the formation of Europe, and deservingly so.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better myself. So I think that's probably a good time to wrap up. Charlemagne, you did well. You came up to our expectations, which was great. And I think, it's a fun conversation in the sense when we're just kind of scraping the surface on a part of history that I don't think either of us would consider ourselves too well versed in. So, I think this was a great one today. And we will be back in a couple of weeks talking about somebody else to be determined, but we will be back. So thank you all for listening, and we'll see you all in a couple of weeks.
Thanks, everyone. Till next time.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the History in Motion podcast. If you enjoyed our journey through time, please subscribe, rate us, and share the podcast with friends. Your support helps keep history alive. Until next time.